Hi everyone. For my final project, I created a subversive dress-up game called Cam's Closet. I made it using Stencil, which is like a games creation software, and then I actually created the individual items and then the doll in Photoshop based off of real images. So, Cam's Closet is, as I said, a subversive dress-up game. Usually, dress-up games are a subcategory of girl games, which Cummings, 2008, describes as a genre preoccupied with the female body and then its manipulation by the player. Um, in dress-up games, players kind of drag and drop objects of clothing or items of makeup onto preset dolls. And through this interactive play process, they learn to commodify and objectify the female body. Um, there's no real way to win or lose these games. There's no explicit moral system. There's no economy system. The only reason why you'd stop playing this game is either because you're bored or you're satisfied by your infinite amount of like scroll / drag and drop options. Another thing is that the virtual avatars that are the dolls of the dress-up games reinforce certain social norms of extreme femininity, of whiteness, of thinness, and richness, and thus they promote a general concealed normative ideology of the internet that assigns a default whiteness or appearance or wealth to the user, despite a presumed neutrality when it comes to identity, like the misconception that anyone is anonymous on the internet, right? Quoting Daniel, 2009. So yeah. And why this is especially nefarious is because the target audience of girl games are preteen girls who use these games to identify with and then construct their own sense of selves. But from an early age, these players are entrenched in a neoliberal ideology where the player is at once designer and consumer of the feminine ideal. So my game subverts the norms of dress-up games, firstly because instead of a blank doll, basically I create a character instead. And so instead of having like an empty blank state to fully project onto, the player has to play as Cam, who, as you can read from the text in the game, is a bisexual woman of color who has a realistic face and body type for sure. Yeah, so she deviates from the dress-up game norm. In order to limit the interpolation of the player into a neoliberal ideology, I followed the advice from Cummings' article, and I added narrative elements to my game, notably one through that introductory script to Cam, and then through the choice of setting, which is the next part of the game. So even though there's still no way to technically fail my game, like there's no way to like judge if your outfit is good or bad at the end, the narrativization that I include contextualizes the player's actions and implies consequence depending on which action are performed. For example, if you're choosing go to grandpa's birthday or whatever, and you know that Cam is a bisexual woman, you might feel caution, right, about what you want to wear and how you want to present yourself at this event or setting. Furthermore, the game reproduces the sense of self-consciousness or curiosity that comes with being queer and deciding to what extent to present as such, or even determining to what extent one presents as such, despite one's will, right? And of course, that depends fully on the setting. And so in the game, in having the player enact a queer woman, I have them relate to her struggles through the empathetic process of choice, of clothing, and of identity presentation. And so the character of Cam is based on a real person, a real queer woman in my life, and so all the items are they actually exist. They're actually part of her closet. So through this game, the player is literally put into Cam's shoes, and she has to decide what to wear and how to present her identity in a certain way. But Cam's Closet also still uses some traditional elements of dress-up games. Overall form, right, the drag and drop kind of thing, feminine color choices, that pink, the cutesy music too. And so keeping these certain game codes strengthens the subversion of other codes and allows me to alter the meaning of the game in a tactical manner. And so, yes, Cam's Closet promotes a kind of like literacy that helps us make or critique the systems we live in, and actively counter a hegemony of play by not reproducing normative ideals of dress-up games. And lastly, Camp Salsa is also an example of media hacking. It was created again on a demo version of Stencil, which is a software typically used to make like platformers, so more complex types of games that require a lot more effort and are usually made towards like a gamer audience. You know, like they're not made for like dress up games at all usually. But so in order to construct this game, I relied heavily on the Stencil community forums and like various YouTube tutorials made by fellow game amateurs. So in conclusion, this game qualifies as alternative media not only because of its subversive meaning that reuses the code of the dress-up game to promote an ideology of performance, of queerness, and of empathy, but also because in creating it, I was part of a community of amateur gaming that were using Stencil and these software in like alternative ways and like relied on each other to build their own games.